to this video for Virtual JaneCon 2023. This is Tea with Cassiane, where we talk about all things Regency dance, neurodivergent, and anything else that catches my fancy, really. The first year I did JaneCon, I made the mistake of going for style over substance, so I had a fairly entertaining video, but it made a lot of oversimplifications and left a lot of things unsaid and underexplained. The next year, I overcorrected and basically made a dry as bones, hour-long lecture. Hopefully, I can avoid both of those pitfalls this time, but let's be real, this is a very long script, so it's probably going to err on the side of being a little dry and academic. Sorry, not sorry. This is what happens when you platform a neurodivergent person and let them info dump about their special interest. They knew what they were getting into. So yeah. If you've seen a Jane Austen adaptation, you've probably seen some English country dancing. But just to refresh your memory in case it's been a while, it looks vaguely like this. Well, actually, that's more of a modern interpretation of ECD as danced by folk groups today than how it actually would have looked in the Regency. But if you want to deep dive into that, I have a whole playlist of videos for you. Anyway, English country dance was the most popular form of social dancing in Jane Austen's lifetime, and it plays an important role in several of her novels, most notably Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Northanger Abbey. My first exposure to English country dance was from the 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice when I was a teenager, and I remember being fascinated by these beautiful, intricate patterns the dancers were performing and having so many questions about what it was, where it came from, and how long it had been around, and what happened to it. Why aren't we still dancing English country dance? It looked like so much fun. I figure I couldn't be the only Jane out there asking those questions, so today, since I was lucky enough to start English country dancing in college and then fell down the rabbit hole of historical research on the subject, I thought I would take a shot at answering those questions. So this is The History of English Country Dance by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. So yeah, this title is an Austen reference, but I kind of do mean that part about being a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. I do my best to fact-check everything I say, and I spend a long time, as in weeks if I'm lucky and months if I'm not, researching a video like this, but I'm far from perfect. I'm also not going to pretend that I'm not biased about English country dance because it's one of my greatest passions in life. So I have strong opinions about it. Plus, I think that the compilation and interpretation of history is inherently a political act because everyone brings their own worldview and biases into writing history, whether they're conscious of it or not. Today, I will be looking at the history of English country dance from our earliest written descriptions in the 1600s until it fell out of fashion in the early 1800s. However, that's not the end of the story. For the fascinating tale of how it was revived as a folk dance in the early 20th century and continues to be enjoyed to the present day, you'll have to wait for part 2 of this video. Prologue! Both kinds, country and folk dance? Okay, I'm going to try to do the TLDR version of this. Modern English country dance is a folk dance. However, historically speaking, from about 1600-ish to about 1830-ish, ECD was a very popular mainstream form of social dance. It only became a folk dance once it fell out of fashion in the cities and among the middle and upper classes, so that only the rural working classes were dancing it. Therefore, when I'm talking about English country dance, before the Victorian era, or in other words, pre-1830s, I will not be referring to it as a folk dance, but after that point, I will. Folk dance as a category wasn't really defined until the latter part of the 19th century, and it was done specifically in opposition to the social dances that were popular in urban, industrial areas amongst the middle and upper classes. So by definition, a folk dance not only has to be a dance of the rural working classes with a strong association with a certain nationality, but by definition it cannot be the mainstream popular form of urban social dancing. Though, FYI, there was a major reassessment among the folk movement in the mid-20th century in which urban and industrial work songs were folded into the folk tradition, so that idea of a purely rural folk tradition doesn't really hold up as much anymore, but I'm getting off topic. I'm going to try to not make this side tangent too long because the folk movement is a complicated and fascinating topic in its own right that encompasses a lot more than just dancing, plus we're going to be delving much deeper into that in part 2 of this video. Part 1. Playford puts it into print. Now, disclaimer, my area of dance history knowledge is mostly focused on the Regency and the Victorian eras, so although I have read some primary sources from these earlier eras, mostly dance manuals, I'm relying heavily on other people's research for this section, particularly Graham Christian's introduction to the Playford Assembly, which gives an excellent overview of the subject, and Anne Day's essay on the cotillion published in the Journal of Historical Dance, Volume 4, which has an excellent discussion of when ECD started being danced at court, as well as by the gentry. Anyway, if I get something wrong, I would be grateful to be pointed to scholarly research on the subject. The first book of English country dances was published in 1651 by John Playford, and it was titled The English Dancing Master. However, there are references to elements of ECD going back at least 100 years before that publication, and the names of many of the tunes that would come to be associated with ECD would be referenced in print throughout the late 1500s and early 1600s. Unfortunately for us dancers, though, there are scarcely any details about the dancing itself. We have tantalizing references, like the fact that Queen Elizabeth I was known to have country dancing done in her privy chamber, but not at court. So make of that what you will, but sadly, nothing concrete about what the dances looked like. Day's essay notes that the first recorded appearance of ECD at a court masque seems to come from the Christmas season of 1619 to 1620, when the Marquess of Buckingham was recorded to have led the maskers in country dances. Day notes that Buckingham grew up outside the court and thus might be more familiar with country dances than the other courtiers and the king. Both Christian and Day, as well as other scholars I've read on the subject, are fairly clear that English country dance, despite its peasanty name, seems not to have come from a purely rural peasant tradition, but was rather a hodgepodge of influences from a variety of locations and social classes. For example, Graham Christian points out that you can find quite a few examples of long ways progressive dance sets, i.e. the ones I showed in that Austen clip, in the dance manuals for 15th century Italian ballos, and in addition he notes references for the figure hey for three can be found in England going back to about 1529. So basically it seems that people created English country dance by taking a bunch of things they liked from peasant dances and music, plus some more cultured dances, tunes, plus some figures and formations they liked from court dances, and put them all in a blender to make ECD. Now, some of you coming from the folk tradition are used to hearing that ECD was an English peasant dance that goes back to time immemorial. So the idea that it was influenced by non-English dance sources and that some of those sources clearly didn't come from the peasantry might seem scandalous. You're welcome to believe whatever you want, but the reality of the situation is that we just have no idea what ECD looked like before Playford wrote it down in 1651. I mean, the distant origins could have been peasant dances, but by the time they finally gotten written down, there were a whole lot of other things tossed in there too. We just don't know what they were before all those elements got combined together. When we look at Playford's book, we do indeed see some big circle dances for as many as will, like Sellinger's Round and Gathering Pescades, that contain very easy figures that you can easily jump into and pick up on the fly. And to me, it seems entirely plausible that these dances had their origin in peasant dances, because we have evidence of big circle peasant dances like the French Brandel that tended to feature simple figures that were easy to pick up. The general rule of peasant versus court dancing seems to be that peasant social dances were designed to be simple and inclusive, so they had big sets with fairly easy figures, whereas court dances were all about showing off. And since the nobility could afford the best dancing masters, their dances tended to be small sets with complicated figures and footwork so that each individual courtier could stand out. In addition to these simpler dances, though, Playford also contains some small set dances such as Newcastle and Feigned I Would that are way too intricate to have come from a peasant social dance tradition, and some of the dance tunes sound more courtly than peasant-y. Playford's book contains a broad spectrum of dances, and most of them fall somewhere in between the examples I've just given, creating quite an eclectic mix. This variety made the dances in Playford ideal for the gentry audience, who could probably afford a dancing master but also didn't have to worry about the stress of court dancing. Even though Playford represents our first written description of English country dancing, there's a lot of information being left out. Playford is writing for an audience that he assumes is already somewhat familiar with these dances and with the conventions of country dancing in general, so he doesn't bother to describe figures or the steps that went with them. He just lists which ones were done to which strains of music. You can imagine how frustrating this has been for dance historians and for people trying to reconstruct these dances. though more on that in part 2 of this video. Also, I wanted to say a little about Playford the man because I think the way he got into publishing dances is just wild. So, Playford published The Dancing Master during the Protectorate, that is, the period after the English Civil War when Parliament had overthrown King Charles I and Oliver Cromwell became the de facto dictator. Playford was pro-monarchy, and he had used his printing press to advance that cause, but when the monarchists were out of power, Playford realized that he should probably cool it with the political stuff if he wanted to keep both his head and his publishing house. So he decided to capitalize on his love of music and publish a volume of English country dance tunes with their accompanying figures, the first of its kind. So literally, the only reason we have this priceless piece of dance history is because there was a revolution and Playford had to lay off politics. The English Dancing Master became wildly popular and ran for 18 editions and basically created a whole industry of dance books with sheet music and figures for English country dance that lasted right up to Jane Austen's day over 150 years later. And the dude created this industry by accident as a way to not literally lose his head. Playford's Dancing Master was so ubiquitous at this period of history that modern ECD sometimes refers to all dances from this era as Playford dances after John Playford. These early dances came in a variety of set formations, such as a circle dance, small sets of 2, 3, and 4 couples arranged either long ways or in a square, and long lines of couples that could accommodate as many dancers as could fill the room, a formation indicated by the phrase, "long ways for as many as will." In terms of figures, all the dances were structured around a repeating chorus, meaning a sequence of figures that was unique to each dance and repeated after every verse, and verses that commonly consisted of the same figures for every dance. The most common of these verses were circling to the right and left, leading up a double or in a double with your partner, siding with your partner, which meant going forward until you were shoulder to shoulder with your partner and then falling back to place, and finally, turning your partner by the elbow or the forearm in a move called arming. And the ubiquity of the verses up a double, siding, and arming has earned this format the ironic contemporary moniker of the USA dance. Yes, that's right, there is an entire genre of English country dances that modern dancers refer to as USA dances. I literally can't make this stuff up. Though honestly, is that just an American thing? I think that might just be an American thing. Brits, let me know in the comments if you've ever heard that acronym. So, early ECD had this USA formula for verses, and then a unique chorus for each dance. But, just to make it more complicated, some dances would actually have a different chorus after each verse, giving the dancers that much more to memorize. I should also point out that English country dance is unusual in that it encompasses dance tunes in a wide variety of meters, which allows a much greater variety of tunes that can be adapted for dancing. Dances can be in a simple duple meter, a simple triple meter, a compound duple, or a compound triple meter, and still equally be considered proper for ECD. And I realize that's music jargon, so let me break this down. Okay, so these are the musical notations for meter. But for dancing, you really only need to consider the top number of each fraction, which represents the number of beats per measure. A duple meter is a meter in which there are 2 beats or a multiple of 2 beats per measure, and a triple meter has 3 beats or a multiple of 3 beats per measure. So if a measure has only 2 beats, it's considered a simple duple meter, and if it has only 3, it's considered a simple triple. If the number of beats is a multiple of 2 or 3, say 4, 6, or 9, then it's considered a compound meter. So when we're talking about typical ECD meters, 4/4 and 6/8 would be compound duple meters, and 9/8 would be a compound triple meter. Technically, 6/8 could be considered a compound triple meter as well, because it's a multiple of 3 as well as a multiple of 2, but in ECD, it's counted as 1, 2, not 1, 2, 3, so it functions as a duple meter. Anyway, that might be clear as mud still, but I hope it helped. This versatility allowed it to be adapted to changing musical tastes, and I believe it strongly contributed to its broad and lasting appeal. It's also interesting to note that from the very beginning, progressive long-way sets would always start with only the top couple dancing and the other couples waiting out until the top couple had danced down to their place, at which time they would be incorporated into the dance. And that was a lot of dance jargon for my non-dancers, so let me break that down. A long ways set is the formation that we see in typical Jane Austen films, like this. It's a long line of couples, essentially. And progressive means that the dancers don't stay in the same place, but instead advance one place up or down the set every round of the dance. Only the first couple would start the dance, and they would progress one place down the set every round of the dance, slowly incorporating the other couples into the active dance as they progressed down, and by the time they got to the bottom, the whole set would be in motion. This is different from how we dance English country dancing today, where the whole set starts at the same time. But it's important to remember that this was a modern innovation of the early 20th century folk revival, and it would not have been how Jane Austen and her heroines would have danced. Heck, even in Cecil Sharp's first volume of the country dance book, the manual for the revival of English country dance, Sharp only briefly mentions a simultaneous start as an alternative that could be done with a room full of experienced dancers, not the standard. And here it is in Sharp's own words. The top minor set, headed by the leading couple, opens the dance by performing the complete figure, the rest of the couples being neutral. This results in an exchange of positions between the leading and the second couple. The second round is now danced by the minor set composed of the second and third couples, which the second one is the leading couple. The rest of the dancers, including the top couple, remain neutral. This brings the leading couple down to the third place from the top of the general set. In the third round, two minor sets will now participate, namely those consisting respectively of the two couples at the top, the second and third of the original set, and the third and fourth couples, originally the first and fourth. The dance proceeds in this way, the leading couple gradually moving down the general set and bringing into action after each round one new couple, and after every second round, a fresh minor set. When, therefore, the leading couple has reached the second place from the bottom of the general set, all couples, with the possible exception of the top one, will be actively engaged and will continue to be so until the dance is concluded. Expert dancers will sometimes constitute themselves into minor sets for the performance of the first round, and thus avoid the gradual and somewhat tedious opening as above described. To my experienced country dance audience, did I just blow your mind? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm still not done with Playford. Yes, I know, this is starting to turn into a non-linear narrative, and it's kind of starting to remind me of Tristram Shandy. And I'm sorry, folks, this is what happens when you let an ADHD autistic person write about one of their special interests and then tell them to make it entertaining. Part 2, ECD grows up. As I said before, John Playford's publishing house went on to republish The English Dancing Master 17 times, for a total of 18 editions until 1728. However, the fact that the same dance manual was in print for almost 80 years didn't mean that the dance form itself didn't change during that time, or that the old-timey dances continued to be popular. In fact, English country dance changed significantly throughout the lifespan of the English Dancing Master's publication. With most new editions, some of the older dances were removed and newer, more popular dances were added. Graham Christian notes in the Playford Assembly that after 1670, all the new dances being published were long ways for as many as will. Further evidence of this change in preference comes not just from the changing content of the Dancing Master, but also from the two supplemental volumes published by Playford that started out as appendices in the 1690s and eventually became volumes unto themselves in 1710 and 1726, respectively. All the dances recorded in these supplements are long ways for as many as will. Another simplification that occurred in the format of English country dance is that by the late 1670s, the verse and chorus format that typified early ECDs started to be abandoned in favor of a simple sequence of figures that repeated each round of the dance. So, what prompted this switch to long ways dances and away from the verse and chorus format? It would be nice if we had some sort of clear historical account that said, right now people have stopped dancing the short dance sets and in favor of the long ways sets because of X, Y, and Z. But historical research rarely works like that. The closest I could find was a treatise on dancing by John Essex, written in 1710, which attributes the popularity of ECD to the fact that the large sets work well in public assembly balls, and that the figures are easy enough for people to pick up without training just by watching the top couple through the dance a few times. Even though Essex was writing a good 30 or 40 years after this change happened, his comment seems to be a good explanation of why the simplified long waist format would become so popular. There's also several reasons why they may have dropped the verse and chorus format. To start with, the verses were always the same handful of figures, which made them the most monotonous part of the dance, while the unique chorus would have been the part of the dance that made it exciting. So people might have preferred just to dance the chorus and skip the verses. Moreover, the verse and chorus format created a much longer choreography to memorize, and as public dancing became more popular, easier choreographies would have made the dances more accessible to mixed crowds. A trend that would continue throughout the next century, so put a pin in that. This format of progressive long way sets for as many as will, and simplified to just one repeating series of figures, is the format that English country dance would retain until its demise and resurrection. In fact, the long waist format may have been another part of the secret to English country dance's broad appeal across the social classes, because it was simple enough that working classes could learn the basics without having to study with a dancing master, but it also appealed to the upper classes because there was a lot of potential to learn more intricate figures, footwork, and other flourishes, and a variety of the most fashionable tunes could be adapted for dancing. ECD had everything it needed to be a cultural phenomenon with tremendous staying power. In fact, ECD had everything it needed to become an international phenomenon. And it did! All across Europe, people were dancing English country dance. Yes, even England's greatest rival. Part 3. The French. I know this sounds absurd because nowadays the French are famous for their dancing and the English aren't. But in 1685, Louis XIV of France actually sent dancing master André Laurent to England to learn ECD and bring it back to France. Laurent went and meticulously notated the dance that he saw and then devised his own version for the French court. The French called their version contredanse. And yes, this is the exact opposite of what Anne Hathaway says in Becoming Jane. The term country dance is not a corruption of the French contredanse. Though in the movie's defense, I have heard that explanation floating around too, and it was only when I started looking deeper into the history of English country dance that I realized it was actually the other way around. I can understand the confusion though, because this is literally the only example I know of French dancing being influenced by the English instead of the other way around. As Day notes in her essay on cotillions, this was certainly not the first time the French, and the French court in particular, had seen ECD. Even those early court masques from the 1620s that featured ECD also had French nobles in attendance, and after Charles I was executed, much of the English court lived in exile in France, and they brought their dancing with them. The same goes for the court of James II after he was overthrown in the so-called Glorious Revolution. At first, the French adapted the long waist sets that were most popular in England at the time. But they also decided that they actually quite liked those small two-couple and square sets that the English had abandoned, actually, so they started playing around with them. But eventually, the French settled on a square set of either 2 or 4 couples called a cotillion, and it became incredibly popular both in France and England in the 1760s. Because the cotillion came from France, the French started referring to them as contredanse français, which was then retranslated into English as French country dance. Sometimes these dances were also referred to as quadrilles, though the term really wouldn't take hold until the early 1800s. According to dance scholar Paul Cooper in his excellent essay on cotillions, sometimes dancing masters differentiated quadrilles as dances for 4 people, while cotillions were dances for 8 people. But a lot of other publications seem to use the two terms interchangeably until about the mid-1810s. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to refer to all French country dances before 1815 as cotillions, regardless of the number of couples involved. In another throwback to older ECD, French country dances went back to the verse and chorus format that the English had abandoned for the sake of simplicity. They called the verses the changes and the chorus the figure. Oh, and FYI, I found out from Anne Day's essay on the cotillions that those were the original terms the English used as well. I'm just using verse and chorus because those are the terms we use in modern ECD, and that audience will find them more familiar. Even though the French imported the idea of verse and chorus from early ECD, they came up with their own verses, and instead of an average of 3 to 5, as dance historian Anne Day notes in her essay on the history of cotillion, there could be up to 9 changes in the cotillion. 9! That's a lot. That's a lot of repetition as well. Now I'm looking at this and I can't help thinking, why did the French prefer the small set ECDs while they were all but abandoned in their country of origin? Although I freely admit that this is speculation, so take what I'm about to say with a huge grain of salt, I think the answer might have something to do with the audience for whom it was written, and to the sharper class divisions that existed in French society. ECD was published to appeal to a broad upper and middle class audience, and as public dances grew in popularity, the more inclusive long ways dances naturally became the most popular. However, in France, the commission for English country dance came from the king, an absolute monarch, who wanted to use them at court, where dancing didn't have to accommodate a huge number of people. Indeed, court dance, as I said before, favored small groups and single couples so they could show off their dancing prowess as a way to gain favor. So in that context, making the set smaller made sense, as did things like adding a ton of verses for people to learn and memorize. Oh, and footwork. Fancy footwork. ECD has always had some footwork, whether that be the singles and doubles of the early dances, the bourrée, which was popular for the large portion of the 1700s, and the chassé of Jane Austen's day, or the step hop that seems to have been popular with the lower classes throughout. But the footwork was never the real focus of the dance. The focus was on the figures. But the French, of course, had to make it more complicated. But I think another appeal of the square sets was that there was a whole lot less waiting around with nothing to do than in a long ways English dance, where if you weren't near the top of the set, you may have to wait several minutes to start dancing. When these French country dances finally made their way to the English-speaking world, boy did the English eat them up. Perhaps they too were growing bored of waiting around with nothing to do in long ways dances. Perhaps they wanted a greater challenge with figures. Whatever the reason, the cotillion became a fairly regular feature in the English ballroom of the late 1700s, and special cotillion balls were even held, though the cotillion never supplanted the English country dance as the primary form of social dancing. Part of this might have been the logistical challenges of putting a cotillion set together. Since cotillions had to be learned in advance, that means you needed to find a group of at least 8 people who all knew it, which meant coordinating in advance to make sure you had enough people. Likewise, dance venues often had to announce which cotillions would be danced in advance so that people had a chance to practice, and venues like the assembly rooms in Bath would even hold weekly rehearsals for people who wanted to walk through the cotillion for that week's ball. Thus, I've only seen a handful of examples of balls that were almost entirely cotillions. Instead, what I typically see is that cotillion balls would feature a certain number of cotillions, but also a good share of ECD along with minuets or whatever other dances were fashionable at the time. Therefore, even though the French were making their mark on country dancing, the English country dance was still king of the ballroom, and it would retain its crown beyond the turn of the century, both in England and abroad. Part 4. George Washington and Ignatius Sancho. So far, we've only discussed the dance in England and France, but it's important to remember that when the English colonized the Americas, they brought their national dance with them. So ECD was being danced in both colonial and Federalist America. And of course, cotillions and quadrilles became quite popular as well. In fact, George Washington was known to have been quite an accomplished dancer, and although he is remembered today more for his prowess at the minuet, he enjoyed country dancing as much as everyone, and in fact there is even a manuscript of dance figures by Asa Wilcox from 1793 that has a cotillion titled George Washington's Favorite. Though whether that meant that the dance was his favorite dance, or whether his favorite meant a person that George Washington particularly fancied, is unclear. Were you today years old when you found out that George Washington was a dancer? Let me know in my comments. I know they didn't teach me that in my American history class. But the newly formed United States was not the only place where ECD was popular. The Scottish and the Irish added their own dance traditions to it to create Scottish country dance and Irish country dance. And in England's Caribbean colonies, they became popular. And in fact, quadrilles are still danced there as folk dances with their own distinctly Caribbean style today. And this is an excellent segue for me to talk a little about the contribution of the Black community to the English country dance, because that's something that gets overlooked quite often, which unfortunately exacerbates this misconception that ECD was a dance only for white people. To begin with, Black people served as dance musicians in both the UK and throughout the British colonies, and in both those colonies and in the American South, both before and after the US won its independence, it was not uncommon to have dance bands comprised entirely of enslaved people, with both their labor and their influence on the music they interpreted going unacknowledged as well as unpaid. In my own research, I have found at least 2 illustrations that show Black musicians in Regency-era English dance orchestras, one of them being the fashionable setting of Vauxhall Gardens. I also want to point out that there were literally thousands of free Black people living in Regency-era London, to say nothing of the fact that there were enough Black people in London in Elizabethan times for the Queen herself to comment on it, which if you're curious about, you can check out Jay Draper's excellent video on the British involvement in the slave trade, which I'll link in the description. And since we know that there were Black musicians in Regency London, it's highly probable that there were dances in which all the attendees and musicians were Black. And yet, they were still just as English as the white people living in London, and their country dancing was just as validly English as a room full of white people dancing. And of course, no discussion of Black contribution to English country dance can be complete without a discussion of the Black composer and abolitionist Ignatius Sancho. He was also the first recorded Black person who met the property requirements to vote in a British election, which is pretty cool. Relevant to this discussion, however, he published 3 volumes of dance music between 1767 and 1779, all of which contain his own original compositions of English country dances. And just as an aside, I have also found reference in the newspapers from 1792 that a 14-year-old Chinese boy was at the king's birthday ball to perform an ode and then stayed for the dancing. And of course, in the 1810s, there are references to the Persian ambassador attending balls. So yes, there were definitely people of color doing English country dancing, and it was not just the African diaspora. Part 5, Jane Austen and the Twilight of English country dance. Throughout the 18th century, English country dance had gradually been drifting towards easier and easier sequences of figures, and in fact, by the end of the century, the sequences of figures had become so simple and predictable that publishers could often freely interchange tunes and figures between the dance books they published and still have them work. Mostly, anyway. Why did this happen? Well, part of it had to do with the mixed skill levels encountered at public balls, which encouraged people to pick simpler figures. However, we can also attribute it to a shift that happened in the mid-1700s from pre-choreographed dances towards having the top couple in the set call the dance. That is, they would get to select the tune and pair it with a set of figures to dance it with. Please note that this is different from our modern notion of calling, which means to prompt figures while dancing them. How and why this started is not certain, though there are mentions of women calling dances going back to the 1750s, and by Jane Austen's lifetime, it was well established to the point of being the expected format of public dancing. In theory, this allowed the lady not only to select the tune she liked, but also to show off her good taste in the selection of figures. Though in practice, people tended to opt for easier figures so they didn't embarrass themselves by choosing a dance that didn't work. And we know there was a problem with people choosing appropriate figures to go with the dance because there were many rules at assembly balls from the period that contained provisions for what the master of ceremonies should do if the top couple of the dance couldn't execute the figures for one reason or another. Dance manuals often published dances with suggested figures, and people often just used the published suggestions. However, publishers were so slipshod in their selection of figures that they often didn't check to see if the figures actually fit the music. The problem of being able to call a successful dance created a market for dancing masters like Thomas Wilson, who in 1809 published a book called The Treasures of Terpsichore, where he gives advice about how to successfully pair tunes with figures that suited them, along with a long list of his own pre-paired suggestions of figures to fit the best-known tunes of the day. It was so popular, it sold out and went into multiple editions. And this is the state of country dance that we see in Jane Austen's novels. Now, since this is ostensibly a video that's being done for Virtual JaneCon, I wanted to take the time to mention that Austen's novels provide us with valuable insight into what English country dancing actually looked like in her time, because Austen wrote about ordinary people in ordinary settings, and she describes the ballroom and the dances matter-of-factly. I did 2 entire videos on this subject, where I chronicled all the historical information that can be gleaned from each of Jane Austen's dance scenes, so if you're interested, I'll stick a link in the description. To me, some of the most interesting descriptions in Austen come from Northanger Abbey, where the young ladies and their partners seem to brazenly cut into sets in order to be near their friends, despite that being extremely frowned upon. I also greatly appreciate the debate that Emma and Frank Churchill have about how big a room you needed to fit 10 couples comfortably. I even did my own calculations based on how much room dancing masters recommended and how much I, as a dancer and caller of ECD, want to have ideally for dancing. But go watch my videos if you want to know more about any of this. Again, links in the description. Jane Austen also gives us a window into a period of dancing that is of particular interest because it was the twilight of the dance form. Tandy cat, you being naughty? Are you being a naughty fuzz? Am I going to have to pick up the cat and shame the cat?
No, just keep going.
Okay. Jane Austen also gives us a window into a period of dancing that is of particular interest because it was the twilight of the dance form. As Austen lay on her deathbed in 1817, she had probably noticed the rise of other popular dances in the last few years of her life, but she also probably had little idea that the dance she loved would soon follow her to the grave, killed by the waltz and the latest iteration of French country dance, the quadrille. Part 5. Death. Sorta. Remember those cotillions we've been talking about? Well, they had their own interesting evolution since they first burst into popularity in the 1760s, and the latest version was known as the quadrille. Two major changes had been made since the 1670s. The first was the invention of the potpourri cotillion, which instead of... Kitty! Hi, Kitty! The first was the invention of the potpourri cotillion, in which instead of dancing the same figure with the same tune between each of the changes, you would switch to a different tune with a different figure each time. Then, just as the English had got tired of the verses in the older ECDs, people got bored with doing the changes in cotillions and instead just started standing around during the music for the changes and only dancing the figure. Although the exact dates for both of these changes are uncertain, this was the form of the quadrille that burst onto the scene in London in the mid-1810s to become a sensation. Now, although quadrilles are mostly associated with ballroom dancing in the Victorian era, these Regency quadrilles were a little different in a few key ways. To start, the figures were slightly different in order to place more emphasis on the ballet-inspired footwork that was so fashionable in the Regency, and to give solos for people to show off that footwork, especially the men whose legs and feet were more visible. So like the cotillions, quadrilles had to be memorized in advance, and they had the additional difficulty of requiring people to be proficient in ballet footwork. This was a boon for dancing masters, but it was a pain in the neck for the average ballgoer, and boy did people complain about it. So why didn't the quadrille just become a passing fad since everyone was complaining about how difficult it was? Well, to start with, as I mentioned with the cotillion, part of the appeal was there was a whole lot less waiting around compared to English country dancing. In addition, only a few sets of quadrilles ever achieved popularity. The original quadrille, known as the French quadrille, and the lancers, which seems to have originated in Ireland, strangely enough. So in order to dance the quadrille, you really only had to learn those two sets of dances, which essentially amounted to about 10 sequences of figures. And then you could concentrate on showing off your footwork. To make it even more accessible, eventually in the Victorian era, they dropped the footwork entirely, but kept a slightly modified version of the figures. Then, to keep things from becoming too monotonous dancing the same quadrilles all the time, the Victorians injected novelty into the dances by pairing different pieces of music with the figures to form quadrille suites. Many composers wrote these suites, and my favorite example of this is the many different arrangements of Gilbert and Sullivan's popular light operas that were adapted for both the French quadrille and the lancers. My only problem is that I really want to sing along while dancing, if you consider that a problem. It might be a perk, actually. At the same time as the quadrille was becoming fashionable in London ballrooms, the big new craze for couples dancing was the waltz. Now, the waltz had been floating around the continent for a while, but by 1810, it still hadn't really caught on in Britain, where people were scandalized by the notion of holding your partner in your arms while whirling around the room. Oh, Lord help us. Plus, it had the whiff of being French, even though it was actually a German dance, at a time when Britain was at war with France. That's not to say there was no waltzing in England at all, but it was still a noteworthy occasion when it did happen, and people felt as if they had to justify their choice. I've heard it theorized that what really made waltzing socially acceptable was the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and all the foreign dignitaries visiting from the continent who wanted to waltz because waltzing was considered perfectly respectable in their country, I mean, what were the English going to do? Tell their continental allies that their foreign customs were too uncouth for the respectable English ballroom? Whatever the reason, by the mid-1810s, the waltz was beginning to take London by storm, and despite continuing protestations by prudish parents for the next few decades, the waltz would take over the ballroom. And English country dancing struggled to compete with these two novelties. The waltz had intimacy and the thrill of whirling around the room. The quadrille had all the fun of a country dance with the added appeal of novelty and without all the waiting around. English country dancing was doomed. Sure, dancing masters tried to keep it alive and came up with some interesting innovations, including lines of four progressing up and down the set instead of single couples, progressive circular dances where everybody started at the same time, and even using the couples waltz as a country dance figure. But it was all in vain. By the 1820s, the switch to waltz and quadrille was well on the way, and by the 1830s, country dancing would be all but dead. Or would it? Sure, it disappeared from fashionable society, but after they had abandoned it, English country dancing never really died. Instead, it truly became the peasant dance it had always claimed to be, because the working classes, especially in the country where they didn't have access to the latest dance fads, continued to dance them, as attested by the novels of Thomas Hardy and others. It also remained in rural America, where long-way sets became contra dance and the cotillion evolved into square dance. And this is the state in which English country dance would be discovered and revived by Cecil Sharp and the rest of the folk dance revival in the early 1900s. And unfortunately, that's where I'm going to have to stop for today. I don't want to go over my time limit, but if you're just dying to know how ECD got revived as a folk dance, I hope to be posting part 2 of this video as soon as my schedule will permit. Thanks again to all the wonderful organizers at Virtual JaneCon for having me back again this year, and thanks to all my regular viewers who make this channel possible. Until I see you again, have an ostentatiously good day.